Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts. Today is a beautiful day in July here in Southern California. And I'm going to take my lunch break here and make an episode as I drink coffee and smoke this amazing Herrera Esteli. Today we're going to talk about the gender of the soul, which I guess you could say is an extension course from the soul episode. So if you're an atheist, you might get some interesting sort of philosophical arguments, which if you invert what I say, you could have perhaps some fodder to question the existence of a soul in general. But for those of you who believe in a soul, as I do, we're going to go into an exercise that I think is extremely valuable and one that I have struggled with nonsensically for many decades. Here's the thing. How many of you believe in a soul? Always have. But when you really contemplate re-entering the universe as simply a soul, the fabric of your imagination ceases. You know, for any of you who've seen like a computer graphic of a world that generates itself in front of someone's view, you know, the ground starts creating itself, the sky creates itself, the people populate the area, the animals, all that stuff. And it's, you know, wherever you look, the world's generating itself. Something in some movie somewhere, you've probably seen something like that. Everyone who's played an MMO has seen it. But it's as if when we leave our body, in our mind, and we're creating this perception of what could it possibly be. For me at least, and I feel like I have a fairly decent imagination, one, viewing the universe as some sort of really dark void is not necessarily a pleasant experience as a human being. But then again, I don't necessarily have warm fuzzies when I think about whales swimming in the Pacific Ocean that's 7 miles deep. You know, I feel like, my God, these creatures swim in almost zero information the entire time. No wonder they love coming up to the surface of the ocean and seeing the sun, seeing people, seeing boats, seeing anything, right? Thank God they have to breathe air to force them to that perception. But when you think about fish that breathe, you know, metabolize oxygen through gills, and you think about them being at the bottom of the ocean, obviously their eyes are different, they can see things and that sort of stuff, but you know, there are various, moles and stuff that don't have eyes, and you just think about them swimming in this void and not having any problem with it because they've never known anything else. A person who's lost their eyesight for whatever reason, either born that way, congenitally, or some injury, you know, living in a visual void seems suffocating once you've seen. But what's funny about it is that I process the existence of a soul in a visual way because I have eyes as a human mortal coil, which is actually idiotic on my part for doing so, because the soul obviously is not carrying around a human flesh and bone, blood-filled water bag all over the universe. It is merely a collection of energy that is. And through whatever means it stays together, you know, perhaps soul energy twirls together just like ethereal energies, but it stays together, and that's an individual. By the way, minor digression here. I am late to the Luc Besson movie, Lucy. My father had actually seen it and said, man, you got to see this movie, it's really great. And then, of course, I've let people around me say they thought it was no good. And I finally was just at my smoke lounge and someone played it. And it's Scarlett Johansson playing a essentially the Sixth Element is what it is. The guy who directed and wrote Fifth Element made this Lucy film, and her epiphany once she starts waking up. The premise of the story is basically very simple. Again, if you're going to see this, you've already seen it. If you haven't seen it, here's your trailer. She is forced into smuggling a very, very exotic designer drug in her stomach, where they open up her stomach, put the bag in, sew her back up. She gets to her destination, and this idiot roughs her up and either punches her in the stomach or kicks her in the stomach and ruptures the bag, and she ends up absorbing about 60% of this exotic drug, which I'll let you watch the film to figure out where that's from. And this jazzercises her gene pool to the point of the Fifth Element character in the Fifth Element. So denser everything in terms of genetic information. But when she goes outside and she looks at the tree, she sees the life energy of the tree and life energy all over the place. And I had told you in my episode about hanging out on the beach and really trying to observe an overlay of energy on top of everything and trying to see the universe from its purest sense. But just as dictated by where life is, we give credit to plants and animals and people, and all quote-unquote inanimate objects were void of this, just so we could see the trend of, petal life forms. When I saw Lucy, when I saw the tree, I'm telling you that's almost exactly what I was seeing when I didn't really see it, but this is what I'm trying to imagine on top of people when I was doing all my research in 2012. Actually, it was 2013, sorry. Yeah, so here I am. I'm thinking about souls and how we exist. What would the ecosystem be? And what's really, really interesting is we sort of, this information isn't really that important to being here, right? We don't have to know how the afterlife works to enjoy this life. That's what my episode in season 1 about the answer is all about. And there's another episode called Origin of Man, which goes hand in hand. It's the very next episode. But the exercise of thinking about where your soul goes after this life is a very interesting thing, because even to the degree that you have a problem conceiving of it, and let's just say in terms of a mental exercise, it's always a train wreck in your brain. You can never take it that far. It only literally goes, a quarter of a second into a scenario, into a simulator in your mind as you try to play God or try to figure out what the simulation would be, and then it stops. And you think, well, I'm not very good at this, or, it just hurts, and you walk away. There's extreme value to that process, and I'm gonna give you a bump, hopefully, when you run into that barrier, such that we can understand the value of that barrier, and then maybe change our perception right at that moment and get a lot further in our thought process towards the soul. And eventually we'll loop into gender. But let's, since I'm going to be calling the episode Gender of the Soul, let's not beat around the bush for too long. The philosophical thrust of this episode is to recognize almost the selfish bias that we adopt in being human if we have souls. I'm not sure, so there's an LGBT group in the world that have, that become very accustomed with going against the biology of mankind for whatever reason. I'm not saying it's bad, but man and man, woman and woman, however you want to do it. And for them, this argument is almost a passé thing, that there is no gender of the soul because their own gender identification is irrelevant, ubiquitous. Again, you have every single strand of possible orientations and that stuff. Again, I think the EU has legislated almost 30. But for those of us who are still hanging on to the old-fashioned how you make babies way of heterosexuality, the gender of the soul is a very interesting philosophical question to say. Is there such a thing? Now, it brings on an immediate reaction to some people because you're thinking, oh my God, I'm so straight. I would never, try to have any type of relationship on a romantic level, on a family level, in terms of making children with my own sex, with my own orientation. But if souls exist, it begs the question as to whether or not they would ever take on any sort of gender bias on the other side. It seems, as the Egyptians would probably tell us, it would be extremely unfortunate to be only right brain or only left brain, right? To either be only a warrior or only be a creative, sensitive soul. And that is why we believe today that a lot of the hieroglyphs that are mistaken for northern Egypt and southern Egypt, the two crowns, one being smooth for the what we believe now to be the right brain, and then the more sharp one, which we believe to be a representation of the left brain, being more acute, sharp, indicative of hunting, with sharp instruments, of building. The other one is wombish and has the shape of a woman's hips, waist, and chest. The women were born with a predisposition to be enlightened with the right brain, and the men are predispositioned to be enlightened on the left brain. And over time, through marriage, they teach each other the other hemisphere. And that's where they believed you achieved some form of enlightenment over time. But then what would be the point of any sort of gender identification on the other side? Well, why do we have genders here in the biological world? We have them because there's an innie and an outie. There's a sperm and the egg and the dart. And without the combination of these two, we do not have the chemistry by which we control the creation of life. Now you might ask yourself, why on earth would there be the separation of these gender mechanisms to create life? And I will explicitly tell you why God did it that way. Without separating the two halves of this, the procreation algorithm would have exploded like the proverbial and very fictional Big Bang. Right? There was a great example of this in Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where a female was being cloned because she was beautiful, brilliant, and they wanted a bunch of her. So someone ordered several 100,000 of her, and her name was Lentilla. But the machine got out of phase, and it got out of phase in a way that the next Lentilla was half created at the time that the last Lentilla was finished. And so to turn the machine off, they had to kill a Lentilla, or perhaps several of them. And so because the world had, the universe or galaxy had become very kind of hippie and designed by committee, they met for years and decades trying to figure out what to do with this dilemma of killing another life. And eventually they just turned the machine off and probably killed somebody in the fictional story. But what happened was they had this explosion of lentillas all around the galaxy. And then so they had this overpopulation, this weird liability that they created all these lentillas. And so they created a male version called Elitnil, which is lentilla spelled backwards, that was absolutely irresistible to a lentilla. And so as soon as they meet, they want to get married, but as soon as they kiss, they both vanish, getting rid of the population problem. So they manufactured all these Elitnils to run around the universe and kiss all the lentillas, right? Kind of a funny story. The idea is, if man could just simply create man all by themselves asexually, and there's a few creatures that can do this, we'd be overpopulated so quickly that the world would reject us. There wouldn't be enough food, wildlife, whatever. Now, on an intellectual level, I think that there's a safe notion, because we know that love exists. It really does exist in some chemical form, in some, I think, honestly, the fabric of the universe form, that typically, in most cases, we have some sort of association between each other that is fueled by love, that brings together us for conception. Now, obviously, there's love at all different levels. There's people who just love the feeling of it, and so they don't necessarily have to be in love with someone to have sex and make a child. But that separation is to control our explosion in population. You get it. So what would happen if you had spent 100 years being a male or a female in a human form, but you have a soul, and then you pass away, and your soul is now joining the universe in whatever form it's in? What matters at that point? Now, I know that it's sort of almost childish to ask the question of whether or not a soul has a gender. But I think it's valuable to parse these moments in our minds, right? Now, what matters here on this planet? In this planet, we actually feel something called isolation. It's very simple to feel that way. And again, it doesn't matter if you're married successfully, you have 10 kids, you got a great job. If you are thinking every day a frequency of thought that no one else around you is thinking, then you can feel isolated because you want to extend the conversation beyond your own perceptions. Because what ends up happening is any subject we individually think about, we can tap into our resources and exhaust the analysis that we can provide to our own idea very quickly. And, hell, it could be a fifth of a second, it could be 5 days, but eventually you're sort of going, well, I've taken this as far as I can take it. I got to find someone else who's thinking the same thing, that perhaps is coming at it from a different angle, who can take my progress and move it forward. Perhaps they've already gotten to my level of progress. Perhaps I've gotten to a place they haven't been able to get to. But once you become soul energy, out of all of the near-death experiences that we've heard, everyone who's ever done DMT that we've ever heard, they all speak of a communion that is immediately apparent, a safe, painless place, right? Once you lose connection with your mortal coil, especially if you're over, say, 30 years old, depending on your health and fitness, I'd imagine anyone over like 75, for instance, who is transcending into their soul, you're losing connection with a pain box. As much as it's worth living and pushing through all that, there's a lot of aches and pains, and your eyes stop working, efficiently. You feel wonderful. Now, again, most detailed stories where it's something a little bit more than a tunnel of light and that sort of thing. I think that neurologists and people who are sort of devout atheists, they really enjoy the tunnel of light story because they've come up with this, philosophy and this hypothesis that there's a chemical dump in the brain at the time of death which can create this light. And because they're terrified of not being the authorities on the universe, they try to put everything in a box. And I'm going to tell you, it's just like every other piece of brain science. It's just a good guess or a shitty guess, whatever it is. It's just they don't want to release their grip on your perception that they're experts. But everyone says, who has any level of detailed story, and again, DMT people have a very similar story, which is all about traveling to a center location in the universe that feels like what they believe to be God. And that there's a colors with no names, as one of the commenters put it recently. The universe is infinitely beautiful instantaneously. Obviously, that sounds pretty cool, right? But now, if you're sitting here in your mortal coil, trying to perceive, how this whole thing's going down, it's difficult for us to abstract away from ourselves our addictions to everything that is in this world. Let's say that you love your house. Now, forget people. People are going to be the really tough one to parse, so I'm going to try to avoid that, meaning your love for your family members that you might immediately think you're going to miss. Let's go with the simple stuff, the material objects, the patterns, the habits. There's people that go to, like myself, I go to a smoke lounge routinely, and I enjoy the communion with them. I enjoy the location. I enjoy the smoking cigars and whatever. And so if I thought about transcending outward, I have this, potential of feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm going to miss all my buddies. I'm going to miss all this stuff. And philosophically, let's just slow down time and then visualize something that's not usually illustrated, which is to say, if you think about your consciousness swimming out to the universe with your soul after you pass away on Earth, okay, to miss something in the midst of that journey. Now, no one's ever reported giving a shit about what's going on Earth once they pass away. There seems to be this utter intellectual release of what's behind you in terms of relative time, right? But we are trying to philosophically get somewhere with our thought process, slowing down this algorithm as human beings. So we haven't transcended yet, so we don't have the benefit of this autonomic system that strips us of our desires. And so as we sit here trying to enlighten ourselves about potentially how the soul works, and especially its bias based on living several hundred years as a particular gender in a human form, to think about and continue thinking about earthly things after transcending, it's almost as if you have a fish hook in your flesh with a very strong wire back to Earth. As you're trying to philosophically engage a simulation in your mind, you're constantly drawn back to worldly things. Now, I only mention that so if, like me, you have been down this road and you did have earthly bonds that seem to interrupt your thought process, I want you to clip them. Or don't allow them to get inside your mind. Or, just kind of push them to the side. Just, there's that thing, I got to remind myself to not worry about, the next Star Wars movie that's coming out, or who's going to sleep with my girlfriend or my husband when I'm gone, There's something that I haven't talked about on the show in any level of detail, but it's the idea that if there is no afterlife, we have this weird little thing that happens here on Earth where some people get really uptight about the notion of dying and not being anymore. Meaning, all of the sort of Kurzweil people are correct. It's just a bag of chemicals, as I always say on the show. But I was talking to some person I just recently met, and they said, well, I don't really worry about if there's not a soul, because if I die and there's nothing after this, then I'm not around to worry about it. And I said, exactly. We have these fig beetles running around, most beautiful scarab-looking beetles you've ever seen. Looks like they're built by Egyptians, and they fly around every once in a while. I'm always trying to see if they're going to land on me during the show. It'd be cool. They sound like helicopters. But there's this weird thing. So let's say that you're into this. You're already hip to this. You've been doing what I've been talking about for years, and none of this is a problem for you, which would be defined in a scenario that when we both discuss the potential of a soul, we are immediately talking about that moment in time when we've essentially escaped the philosophical gravitational pull, the human conceptual event horizon of our previous existence, and now we're outside of all the influence of that, and we are a pure soul made of soul energy, perhaps just life force, whatever that is, right? Consciousness. Well, then what? Some of you will immediately recall several tales of people going to the other side and meeting either relatives or individuals that took care of them, who, if they're able to tell us about the story, someone said to them, and this is what's interesting, is what I'm about to tell you, I'm slowing this down because what I'm about to say has been said by countless people. I won't even try to put a number on it, but countless people have had near-death experiences, meaning their body died, they left their body, they went and visited the location I'm talking about here, and then came back in their body, forever converted about the afterlife existing. They absolutely could never be convinced that it doesn't exist. But they always say the same thing. The same thing. They say that the person that they met, the being that they met, said it's not your time. and sent them back down. Now, it sounds very man-made, doesn't it? I'm going to slow this down, too, because there's a lot of things that people tell us that we don't really parse, in my opinion. One, what's interesting is that someone actually, at this other location, that there's a time when we're supposed to go. Or there's an index of years where you can go within this decade. It's okay if you die in this decade. But there are, to be told that it's not your time signifies a couple things. And these people aren't superheroes. These people haven't, it's not like Nikola Tesla, and he's 13 years old, or, when he was a young kid, actually, he almost died of a sickness, never had any out-of-body experiences that I'm aware of. But, I could see someone saying, it's not your time. You need to invent alternating current and wireless technology, and you need to, show us that there's free energy. Because even though it won't be realized in your lifetime, in 2017, Eric Dollard will have dug you up for 10 years and taught the world that Einstein was a fraud, a plagiarist, a wife-beater, etc., etc., and that Tesla is the one who actually invented something, whereas Einstein invented nothing. So the alluring thing is that people who have heard this and been told this pretty much lived normal lives. The only thing out of the ordinary was that they actually shared the experience of the near-death experience to us. Some of them in televised documentaries, right? But, I'm always telling you guys, especially in the Program Universe episode, that this simulation runs flawlessly, right? There's no glitch in the system for real, unless you want to say Mandela effect is an error and not an organic byproduct of frequencies and the perception of time as human beings experience it, right? But somehow we die too soon sometimes, which is interesting. Now, whoever coded this universe did a perfect job. So the interesting thing is that to be told it's not your time, the overlaying subroutine that is us, when we're born, when we're supposed to live, and when we die, and maybe perhaps what we're supposed to accomplish while we're here, has sort of an anomaly, maybe a bug, right? Why would anyone tell you that you're not supposed to die, that you're supposed to go back down and be in your body? Well, the only thing I could possibly think about or contemplate is that there's something you have to do, And it could be just something as simple as, the butterfly in Peru affects the price of tea in China. There's something you're going to trip on, contribute, think, do, not do, that is important to the overall algorithm of the universe. Now, I've been beating up on the show the brilliant British writer Douglas Adams. I'm not beating him up, but using his material in the show to make points. And I'm going to repeat myself one more time, because the more I talk about it to you, the more there's a beautiful thing to it, which is, in his book, in his 4 books, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he, by the second book, had told everyone that the computer that is Earth is a computer, and it's calculating the question to life, the universe, and everything, of which the answer is 42. He took it to the next level in the next 3rd and 4th book series, where he had engines inside of ships that were bistros, where you go and eat, and everything that you do inside this restaurant is part of the code that runs the engine of a ship. I mean, it was just fucking brilliant, right? The interesting thing about being told that you have to go back when you may perceive yourself as being an incidental life in the big collection of things is, what if we were some sort of program virtually identical to what Douglas Adams had insinuated in his book? They were actually calculating something. I think that's fascinating. It doesn't have any real root. I can't point at anything and go, see, doesn't that make sense? Just something to keep in the back of your head when you think about us being a simulation. And anyone who invests time and energy in something typically has a purpose, right? Now, sometimes you get bored and just go to the mall to walk around, but the purpose is to get rid of your boredom. There's always a purpose to everything. We as human beings, I could imagine having very incidental engagements, but when you think about the people potentially running a Truman Show, I'm willing to bet there's a pretty big purpose to all this, right? Save us being just entertainment for another realm. Doesn't seem like any of the aliens that have been, philosophically or I should say romantically said to be encountered ever had the ability to laugh, right? Greys are supposedly the most monotone R-factor robots you've ever heard of. The Raelian dude, it's always some peaceful kind of hippie thing. So it's never just like, a whole race of Robin Williams coming down having a good time. Christ, wouldn't that be awesome? I think man gets funnier with time. I would hate to think that we would complete a couple million years of evolution, get past war and monetization of our existence, and then we're just a bunch of boring bastards on the other side. Would that suck? But once we get past this thing, to go back to our episode here, our existence on the other side is where I think we feel some intellectual pain. I'll give an example. And I think this is why it leads into a lack of belief in reincarnation or the lack of willingness to believe in reincarnation. And I'm telling you right now, I feel the same pain that I'm about to describe. Intellectual pain. Let's say that you're madly in love with someone and you've had the fortune of spending a good portion of your life with that person towards the end of your life, your husband, your wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, best friend, and you contemplate dying, but you love this person. They complete you, as they say. I mean, they really do. You love every fiber of their being, and you don't just love who they are internally, but you love who they are physically. You love looking into those eyes and that enchanting smile and that sympathetic, hug or moan or whatever happens to keep life interesting, right? And then there's this notion that you die. And you lose access to that beautiful form, your beautiful form, their beautiful form. Even if you're dying, you're losing access to them in one way or another, depending on how this afterlife works. So man immediately struggles with the notion of losing his or her identity. And that identity is obviously attached to some sort of gender identification of some sort. We don't want to lose access to our loved ones. Be they related to us, be they our partners in life. It saddens us to no end. And the more we contemplate being away from them, it saddens us more and more. But let me make a suggestion here on how we might interpret this to reduce this level of concern. Now, the Mormons have an interesting belief system in that they believe that you retain your body in the other realm. That's how they've solved the problem. There is no pain for a Mormon in the afterlife because it's essentially a human party in heaven. But let's go back before Joseph Smith stole a book in a prison cell in Missouri. Man has not been cremating forever. Man has buried bodies and entombed themselves and, embalmed themselves for thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And again, forget all of your bullshit history about Egyptology. Right? They go back to easily 40,000 BC. Don't be fooled. But what happened back in the day when they believed you needed your body to go to the other realm? What would happen if, in building the pyramid, for instance, a gigantic 50-ton rock fell on a worker and squished him to the width of a millimeter? They're gone. Building the Hoover Dam, when someone fell down into the cement and they just kept pouring the cement and they're just stuck there in time, frozen, dead. There's all kinds of ways that we perish, and there is no mortal coil left of any kind. I don't know how they dealt with that idea that you take your body with you, or that you need to take your body with you with those scenarios. I know it sounds like a little gruesome digression, but it's fascinating because it is gruesome and we don't talk about it, but it is something that is part of the philosophical possibility in certain religions. I don't know that Mormons engage in cremation. I don't think they do, because they believe you need your body. But what happens to a Mormon that experiences an accident and such that their body simply doesn't exist anymore? A plane crash, something. Obviously, the simple answer is you get a new model as soon as you go to the other side. I've actually asked them, I said, well, how old would I be? Oh, any age you want to be. I'm like, okay, that's cool. Again, these are all pacification philosophies so that we don't have to experience any intellectual pain when it comes to perceiving what's after this life. Right? But would the creators of the universe create a situation where you would perhaps marry your high school sweetheart, eat well your whole life, avoid all the vaccinations and horrible toxins that are out there, live a full life, both of you are the same age, you both live to be 100 years old, you die, within 60 seconds of each other's life, holding hands in bed. What happens to you? Do you ascend to the other side as the gender that you are, in love with this one soul, and then you spend eternity together in some sort of nirvana heaven, where there's no state change? You're simply a static being with no more need for choice, because there is no darkness. There really is no left and right. There's just there. And that's where, in our illustration, in our minds, we've got pain associated with the notion of losing our loved ones on earth. And then once you ascend all the way into a heavenly realm, you have pain with this notion of zero reincarnation, of being stuck in this world. But as humans, we believe that as long as we can maintain some sort of identity to what we are here, that there is no transformation, there is no birthing process. The caterpillar always stays a caterpillar and never becomes a butterfly. For a lot of us, the butterfly is the soul. What can a caterpillar do? Well, he runs around on the ground, as I said in a previous episode. But once he essentially cocoons himself and rebirths himself, think of the vantage point, the beautiful vantage point of turning into a butterfly and then getting out and flying all over the place. Seeing, if there's any one creature that enlightens itself, it would be a butterfly, because they've got this amazing ground perception, eating all the vegetation and stuff, and seeing everything really close up, and then flying and seeing a house. We always say that an ant can't conceive of the home that he is invading, and I think that that's probably true. But a butterfly is an insect that gets to see it all. Of course, any flying insect could be put in that category. But, a wasp isn't, ground-based and then becomes a flying thing. It's all cocooned up in its little embryo until it comes out and it immediately flies, roughly, right? If you've ever struggled with the notion of a gender of a soul, it is most likely because, like all of us, you're very comfortable and familiar with your human body. And we have potentially the impossibility of truly conceiving of ourselves outside of what we look at in the mirror every day. The more you grow comfortable with your body and your outward personality, you get everything straightened out to at least a decent level. Your character and your persona start to become one and the same. They're homogeneous, congruent with each other. Their frequencies are very identical, so you don't have to pretend to be someone to other people. You can actually be who you really are. You finally feel like the battle has been won. Regardless if there's daily skirmishes about life, you've essentially won. And so it was difficult to get there, wasn't it? You worked your ass off to get there. And dying is sort of one of these things of like, damn it, I just got this figured out, now I have to die? Or, if you get it figured out and you're 50 and you're fairly healthy, and then you get to 70 and you start having aches and pains that really adjust the way you can walk down the hallway. You're like, damn, I only got like 20 years of this sort of amazing feeling of being really content with who I am as a person, the choices that I made, I was happy with. Then there's the whole thing about, sexual orientation. If you're heterosexual, or even if you're homosexual, the sex that you're not attracted to, it can be nauseating to think about crossing those lines. And so we have this barrier that we experience day to day here as human beings. Then when we think about dying and changing genders and coming back the opposite gender, it's all from the perception of being a human being. So that doesn't need to be belabored to any degree. You've all had that feeling if you've considered it. Now let's talk about what can happen if we get rid of this, okay? And this is not about, trying to saw down the need for, biological orientations such that we can continue procreating, right? You don't want the whole world to go, in my opinion, if the whole world went homosexual, then there would be no more humans, right? If we were steadfast to our alliance and we didn't have little mishaps here and there, we would simply disappear, wouldn't we? So it's important that there's at least a critical amount of human beings that feel heterosexual if we're to continue. But in the other realm, in the purely celestial realm, as they often say, I'm willing to bet it doesn't matter. I'm willing to bet that the notion of gender in general and probably the informational connect to the idea of being stuck inside of a body, it might be instantaneously forgotten. Right? If you've ever saved someone's life in any type of tiny way, I was a lifeguard, so as much as one would poo-poo true near-death experiences, I can tell you I've jumped in several times and pulled little kids out of 3.5 foot water that they couldn't swim in. In terms of their memory of that moment, a lifeguard saved their life. Now, obviously as a kid struggled, a bunch of people would have jumped in, but that was my job, right? Didn't happen that often, but it happened. And the thing is when you're in that drowning phase, you're in a panic, you're irrational. And they train us for all this when you become a lifeguard, that, when you try to save people, they may have even completely accepted death and they're floating on top of the water face down, and when you save them, when you do a hook around their neck and turn them around to face the air, they go crazy sometimes because they want the panic that they had subdued immediately returns once oxygen goes in their mind, and it reignites. Pretty much, it's like their program was already in session, was pushed on pause, and then you turning them up to air pushes play again on the panic button. But what's interesting is once you yank them out and you get them all taken care of, they calm down. They realize there's no imminent threat. They're going to live a nice long life as long as they can figure out where they can swim, where they can't swim. There's this peace and there's this calm. And then there's this sort of weird moment in their life where they've gone past this panic one time in their lifetime, and as other moments of panic come up, there's a familiarity with the frequency of panic. If you took your whole life and drew it in a timeline, and then you put little notches in there for every time you've ever been panicked that you're going to lose your life, a bad car accident or almost car accident or whatever, when you feel, or when you're in it, every single previous moment in your timeline pops up like a line crossing, the overall timeline of your life, and you immediately see all of those other moments. But the second you go back to being calm, all the other moments, for whatever frequency you're experiencing, highlight back up. So if you feel wonderful, all the times you've ever felt wonderful pop back up in your timeline, and all the bad moments go down. Everything that doesn't match goes down and goes away. We talk about frequencies on this show a lot, and I will tell you that one of the big mechanisms you have to understand is, let's say your life is neutral to positive. You're having a good time. And life is good. It's not amazing, but it's really good. And you let someone in your life who is having a bad time. They bring in that other frequency. And the more you try to help them, the more that it reminds you of your frequencies that were very similar. And sometimes you can keep your cool and counsel them and it's all good. But sometimes if you continually suffer with them and trying to help them, it will exacerbate your frequencies in the past that were like theirs, and you will change your frequency to theirs, and you will start living their suffering. And that's why the old saying is that people who are depressed or negative will only bring you down. They can never bring you up. And it's the truth. They must go out and find for themselves what will solve the problem. Again, you can do a session with them and tell them everything's going to be okay, which you should, and perhaps suggest something to them if you can think of anything. But there's almost like okay, now you got to go away. You got to go away for a little while. It could be 8 hours, could be a couple days. Whatever it is, you got to go out and you got to find your mother of invention to get out of this problem. Because I got my own thing going and I cannot have you disturbing me. And you might think that that's pretty selfish, but let's think about it this way. What if one of your closest friends came down with tuberculosis? Tuberculosis is an airborne disease, meaning the more that they inhale and exhale in the room with you, you have a fair chance of catching tuberculosis yourself. And so there's a quarantine that happens for the person that's got TB. You can't go in the room with them. You're still their friend. You're still going to assure them that the medical treatment that they're getting is going to absolutely solve the problem. But in the meantime, all you can do is talk from a distance, through a window, through a microphone, through a telephone. And in that scenario, your friend who is suffering understands that there's a physical proximity that must be adhered to and observed. And they're okay with it. There shouldn't be any problem with taking that situation and mapping it onto emotional problems as well. Sometimes it has to be at a distance. Sometimes. If it's something that's going to trigger you internally, and I hate to even use that word because it's such a pop culture word now. So let's go back into souls. If I told you that as soon as you transcend, you lose track of all the souls on earth, that would be a depressing statement, wouldn't it, if that were true? At least from the intellectual perception that we have as human beings, perceiving the problem, we may realize that once you go to the other side, you don't care anymore. There's a great Twilight Zone episode, which name escapes me, but it's all about this young girl who's reaching the age where she is to shed her God-given body and select a genetic replacement for a new body. And you go to the store and you look at all these human bodies, and there's very few models, but they're all numbered. And so someone will say, oh, you got the 27, oh, you got the 14. And it's played only by about 4 actors because they're playing multiple roles because people have multiple people have picked the same body. But the most touching thing is in the last part where this girl says essentially that she doesn't want to change. There's nothing wrong with her, that the characters in the Twilight Zone have told her that she's broken because she doesn't look gorgeous and beautiful. The actress looks like Sissy Spacek, but I don't think it is. Way before her time. But in the end, she gets the new body. They force it on her. And in the end, the new body doesn't care about the old body. The entire argument of individuality was subtracted from her ability to think. And so she didn't have any more concerns about what she was. It's not a fun thought to think that the soul loses its loyalty to its family members, its friends. It goes to the other side and it simply can't care enough in any way, shape, or form to worry about the previous life. Maybe that's the case, maybe it's not. I think that these dilemmas and these arguments are often sheltered by, the Christianity, for instance, which says there's no reincarnation. It is a sin to reuse God's machine more than once. Or not, reuse it at all, right? You mustn't be reincarnated. Now, let me loop back on something that happened to me because someone asked me to explain it again. I guess I'll explain this one more time, and maybe I'll explain it once in every season. But I had an experience, and for those of you who are long-time listeners, you've heard this maybe twice in the past. Now, I'm not a guy who thinks I see ghosts. I don't think I've ever seen a ghost in my entire lifetime. I believe that I have communed with spirits at least twice. And the lesser of the two is my grandmother, who passed away, visited me about noon in my bedroom. I was sleeping in, and she was hovering over me in my mind's eye. Again, not an apparition in the room that anyone could see. And she simply said my name, and then she said, I just want you to know I'm on the other side, and I'm okay now. And 2 hours later, my mom called me and told me that my grandmother had passed away, her mother. So I was like, yeah, I know. She came and told me. Okay. And what's really strange is my mom, she's just not open-minded enough to just take that at face value. It's always sort of some condescending, laughy smirk that says, oh, you silly, dumb person. You know, it's really funny. But it happened. It absolutely took place. But the most life-changing perception for me about souls, which I think will put a huge Band-Aid on any of the pain that you might have experienced in listening to me talk in this episode, has to do with the amazing Walt Disney. So in 2007, I met one of the oldest surviving Imagineers that Walt Disney hired himself, a man by the name of Bob Gurr, Gurr. You can just look him up. Still alive to this day, looks extremely healthy. I'm willing to bet this guy will live another 15 years. He's going to be about 100 years old, most likely. But I met him at a buddy of mine, Sid Mead's, at Christmas Day, and we had this conversation about Walt Disney, because Bob had never been there before or since. And it was just the most touching conversation talking to a person who worked for Walt Disney. You know, this is 2007, right? And he got choked up, and he just told me, he goes, man, the world has no idea the amazing person who died that day. And believe me, in the conversation, there was no sense that, you know, Walt was anything he's accused of today. I think that accusing Walt of all these negative things is just a diversion story. I would suggest you, unless we have some black and white proof, which I don't even know how the fuck you have that today, don't believe any of the hype around this guy, that he was a bad guy. So a few weeks later, I'm at Disneyland. I had a season pass at the time because they were $368 for the entire year, no blocks and free parking. Now they're over $1,000. And my girlfriend and I were going to the park, and we're very hungry. And when you have a season pass, you don't go and just ride all the rides all day long. You go and we had maybe 4 rides that we would ride inside the Disneyland park. But we were going there to eat. We were both hangry going in. So we go in, and when you go into Disneyland, for those of you who have been there, there's 2 entry points underneath the railroad track. We went on the right side. This is in California, the only one that Walt has ever been to. And there's an employee restroom off to the right of the bank, which has now been moved. So I'm standing in front of the bank, and I'm sort of so hangry that I'm annoyed that she has to go to the restroom and delay. So she goes down the restroom, and I'm just standing there. Sunglasses on, just like you see me today, and I'm just staring. And I kid you not, in my mind's eye, Walt Disney walks up to me. I could only assume he was like 30 to 35, somewhere in there, wearing a suit classic to that time, sort of late 20s, early 30s, no hat. He had a cigarette in his hand. And he waves with the cigarette, and he says, you know, Bob Gurr's over there. You should go say hi. And what's interesting about it is my mind doesn't form sentences like that. I don't say it as cool as that cat did, right? So immediately, I had this, Google/iPhone red pin in my brain pulling me towards Tomorrowland. Now, the 3 major rides that her and I would ride on any one visit would be Star Tours, Space Mountain, and perhaps Pirates of the Caribbean, because Pirates is like 15 minutes long. You get to sit down and enjoy the world. Maybe the haunted house, maybe. It'll be like a 4th little floater in there. But we're going to this Mexican restaurant in Frontierland. It was our staple at the time. The food was great at the time. So that's where we're headed. But you have to go down Main Street, past Adventureland, and the next park over is Frontier. She comes out of the bathroom. We start walking down Main Street. Now we are tracking towards the Frontierland because we're hungry and we're ornery. But I say to her, because of this pin, I should have told her at the point, hey, this happened to me, but come on. I'm going to tell my girlfriend that Walt Disney walked up to me and told me where Bob was. I said, well, let's go this way first. Not let's go ride a ride, let's go this way first. And she, for whatever reason, didn't argue with me and said, okay. And she starts following me. And it's moderately full. I'd say the park was probably about 50% full. Still daytime. We turn the corner. I pass Star Tours. Don't even look at it. Don't make any mention of potentially riding that ride. And she's still following me. Somehow she was pacified through this process, right? Now, the only other ride in this entire place is Space Mountain, which is continuing way down to the right. I don't go anywhere close to that place because the pin is dragging me into the juvenile area where Autotopia is and where the former submarine ride was, which has been shut down for at least 2 years as it's being restored to Finding Nemo. So I start going up this hill. I pass the Moonburger place. I go up the hill. She's following me. And at this point, I am so off base from where her and I ever spend any time. Looking back, I'm like, how on earth did she not ask me, what the hell are we doing here? I don't like Matterhorn, which is right at the top of the mountain to the left because it's too rough. And right at the top of the hill is Bob Gurr and his buddy. I walk right up to him. I said, Bob, because he had just met me, so I was familiar to him. How the hell are you? Oh my gosh, I'm Mark, blah, blah, blah. Just reminded him, and we start shaking hands and talk, and all four of us are shaking hands. And he goes, well, we went mountain biking today, and now we're here to see the grand opening of this Nemo ride. And, it was after me asking him, what are you doing here? And he goes, well, this is Imagineering Day. Points over his right shoulder. He says, see all the people in line? He goes, those are all Imagineers. And he goes, see this little lapel on my collar here on my shirt? He goes, this is Imagineering button. You're going to see these all over everyone today. I'm like, wow. He goes, yeah, it was busted. So I've been waiting in line for an hour. So we finished talking about stuff. I was telling him, how amazing it is that he's 75 years old mountain biking. And, I was probably 35 years old going, or 40 years old or whatever, saying, I don't even mountain bike, man. It's too dangerous. Right then and there, when we finish our conversation, literally it's the last sentence comes out that seems to be a logical end to our conversation. A cast member comes down this ramp because you have to load really up high for this kind of big tank. It's the ride, and she says, and because he designed the propulsion system for the submarine ride that had been retrofitted, so he's the first one in line. He is being celebrated. But the cast member comes down and says, Mr. Gurr, we're ready for you. See you later, goes away. Now, let's rewind. Walt Disney, in his sort of ethereal, I don't mean this, as the particle reference, but in his life force, he was in front of me, purely identified as Walt Disney. Taller than me, which I think is great. It was just totally proportional, as if he'd walked up to me. And he's only there for 2 or 3 seconds, right? Bob Gurr's over there, you should go say hi to him, and he just does one of those, walks on. Then I find Bob exactly where Bob was standing. I didn't make any mistakes walking somewhere else and then having to correct. I walked straight to that guy, and I walked to the most illogical place in the park. And not maybe the most illogical, but a fairly illogical place for me to be. And he was right there. 10 years later, I asked my buddy Sid for Bob's number. I guess maybe 9 years. I called him last year, and I left a message with him, and he called me back here at this house, and I said, Bob, I just got to tell you this story. You remember when Nemo was saying, he completely remembered the moment, right? Sharp as a nail, man. And he said, I told him about Walt sending me over to him, and he just lovingly said, you know what? He goes, this isn't as amazing or as uncommon as you might think. He goes, this happens all the time at the park. And he's not trying to blow smoke on my ass. He started giving me example after example of being in parking lots in the area and supposed to be meeting people at the park. And, the parking lots will be completely empty, no cars. He gets out of his car, walks 10 feet, turns around, there's cars parked, and the people are walking towards him. But he goes, I don't see any way they could have been there beforehand. Just weird things, but there's all kinds of stories about that from all kinds of other Disney employee friends of mine. I tell you that story right now because it doesn't give us any, well, I shouldn't say any. It doesn't answer a lot of the questions we're talking about, right? But let's rewind and slow it down. If what I saw was real and not some bizarre daydream based on me feeling Bob's life force over there. Because I wouldn't imagine that a 75-year-old guy, regardless of his association with Disneyland, would spend a lot of time going to the park. But he's got a big, fun soul, so he does. But I didn't have that answered until I saw him there, right? But Walt Disney walks up to me, and let's just say for the sake of argument that this moment happened the way that I experienced it. Walt kept his identity. Walt kept his gender, at least to me. Walt was not anything other than what Walt probably would have been if he had been alive and actually been there. He was trying to create a union between two people who knew each other, who obviously, if he can see into my soul and see into Bob's soul, he knows that there's an overall appreciation for what he did to the park, what Walt did to the park. Right, there's two parks when you go to Disneyland, which is the Anaheim, California version. Again, Walt never went to any of the other parks because they didn't exist before he passed away. When you walk in, you either see a completely nauseating, commercialized, super corporate sponsored amusement park, or you see the remnants of the park up to the year of 1965, and perhaps all of the additional creations that were based on things on the blueprints in 65, like Space Mountain, for instance, was definitely something that had been theorized prior. Even Disney World had been theorized on paper before Walt died. So we see, in our opinion, what Walt contributed to the park, and we subtract all the rest. And so we're just enjoying this sort of remnants of what's there. It's almost as if you go to Rome and you look at all of the artifacts that are there. You don't see the Colosseum in a broken way. In your mind, you see the Colosseum finished with, potentially 1,000 people in there watching people get pulled apart by lions, right? The big question at the end of the argument or of the analysis and the process of examining what might be after this life is the following for me, personally. Do we need to know what's after this life? In the episode The Answer, I talk about it, not really. If you have the privilege of analyzing because you have time left over in your human day, you've done everything you can do and you need a rest, and somehow there's enough energy, you have enough analytical ability to think about these things, slow down time, and take every step of what happens after life, potentially, combining all the stories that have ever been told, sifting through them. Again, some people have afterlife experiences and they see Jesus Christ and the devil and hell, and what's interesting about that is that in my personal experience of gathering information, sort of willy-nilly, just as it occurs to me, is that most people don't have those hell and damnation experiences. In fact, they have quite the opposite. They have beautiful non-religious experiences, save perhaps the insinuation that the light that they see, whether it be through a tunnel or through some center of a galaxy of souls, is God. Now, in closing, let's just take an assertion here and go with it for a second. Let's say we do reincarnate. And again, don't get all bent out of shape. I mean, you can say, look, I get some time with Elvis before I come back, or my grandmother, or whatever. I just want to chill. I just want to relax, and I don't want to pay taxes for a while. But you do come down eventually, and you recycle by your own choice. It's just the way the universe works. And let's say that, gender is sort of maybe something you can choose, but after you live for an infinite number of years, you're going to go to the other side. In fact, you might be any one of these 29, 72 genders, depending on what source you're looking at. You're some interesting combination of all of the possibilities, and you're simply doing it because you're like, well, why not? I've done it all. I used to be all bent out of shape about being a girl. And then after, 100,000 instances of being a man, I just thought, well, whatever. I don't have all my immaturities about being perceived as potentially weak. I could be a strong female, whatever. Now, we say that truth gives you a cool, warm, blue feeling inside your system, right? Lies are a very intense, scattered, chaotic, cancerous feeling, which is why you should never tell them. If you're hanging on to one, you should find a way to let it go. As I've said on the show, I think one of the most therapeutic things you can do is talk to strangers about your lies such that you get a chance to say it, like confession, but you don't have any ability for that to come back and hurt you. And so you can be completely open. Obviously, finding someone you can trust in this realm is not easy, but it's possible, right? the almost, I would say, do I dare say, genetic barrier towards thinking about crossing over your gender could be construed as a moment where we take that feeling of either rejection or acceptance and we say, it is, the truth is that I am the gender that I am. Because I feel such a strong biological connection to my gender, there's no way that when I leave and become soul energy that I'm going to release this bias. And that might be true. Could be just because you're human. You have this huge bias, right? Now, gender is obviously a very dirty word these days. There are folks that can't figure out what gender they are, and so they get very angsty and agitated by the argument within their own mind, and what they try to do is demonize any specific reference to gender such that they don't have to deal with the chaos in their own mind of trying to figure out what they are. Society says you have to pick one. And so they don't want to pick one. And so they get angry and they say, don't reference gender. Don't say boy, don't say girl, don't say men, don't say women. So we let this tiny group of folks who are struggling, and God bless them, to create this bizarre, almost different way of seeing all of ourselves. But let me throw out perhaps an unpopular conclusion to the idea. If souls have no gender, then perhaps one of the things that we could think about in terms of going along with these individuals of here on earth, sort of maybe reducing the significance of putting things in gender boxes, is that what if we were more prepared for the afterlife? If we could be more ubiquitous and agnostic and androgynous about our souls, about who we are as individuals, that we are consciousness. Now, obviously, most folks that feel secure in whatever they are, they've made a decision this is what they are. They have their reasons, be it what they believe to be a genetic one, a social one, or both. But what do we gain by pulling away from our souls at least? Let's get rid of the debate here on earth. Let's go back into the soul realm. What would we call ourselves if we were simply souls? We have a lot of words to choose from, right? Let's put in our little lexicon the word consciousness, awareness, identity. At a minimum, I think those three terms could be used for any one of us referencing the other in this realm, in this celestial realm. Some people worry about losing their identity in the other realm. And I think it's not, they're wise enough to say, whatever your first and last name is in this world, you're probably not going to be referenced that in the other realm, no matter what you believe. You're going to have some, prince symbol that you are, right? An unpronounceable symbol, because in the other realm you don't have the instruments to pronounce anything. You're just consciousness. I would imagine that your consciousness has a shape and an identity like a snowflake, and that perhaps if there is any sort of familiarity in the other realm, if you and I bump into each other and we've never met on earth, we meet and you have a symbol that you are. It is that when I look at your energy or feel your energy, you have a uniqueness to you, and I have a uniqueness to you. And so perhaps our uniqueness affects the frequencies around us such that, like penguins who come back together to mate, they always seem to find their monogamous assigned mate. The whole penguin thing where they lay their eggs, and then they hatch and become little tiny penguins, little birds that can't really do much for themselves, and the parents have to take turns going off and feeding. They can hear, supposedly, the squawk of their offspring as opposed to the squawk of other offspring, which really is phenomenal if you think about the distinction of frequencies. So I don't have any answers as to whether or not we do have a gender. I assume we don't, personally. But you have to think about it yourself. I think the larger debate here or intellectual thought process or enlightenment that we can perhaps achieve is to be able to have enough conversations for whatever reason, whether we're debating, some sort of identity on the other side or gender on the other side. If the question of what happens after this life is interesting to you and perhaps even burdenous to your overall daily consciousness, the more conversations we can have that are sort of perhaps not very enlightened, we're having just sort of willy-nilly lowbrow conversations about what could possibly be in the other realm. The more that we have these conversations, it's almost as if you're building in a forest your first village where, you're not sure how to build a shelter, but the first thing you do is start clearing out the brush and creating a place to sit down, and then eventually someone goes, well, what I did was I took these branches and I kind of made a little fence, and so now the animals that crawl on the ground don't get inside our little area, and then we put a roof over it, right? So slowly we build the house of cards. I shouldn't say house of cards. We build the scaffolding that we need to stand up higher and stand up higher and stand up higher, and we may end up finding that that was a whole branch of thought that we just flushed, but we have to go through all this process, all this debate, to get to a point where we ascend to those other levels of understanding. Does God want us to understand the other side, if there is one? I don't know. Are we to be distinctly human and not really know about the other realm? It would seem that there's a lot of indicators that could be the truth. We are not one with the universe in any consciousness way, but perhaps the reason why we're reincarnating is to achieve this level of ascension and go back to the atomistic way of believing where, the spiritual realm and the human realm are one. Although distinct and having their own ecosystem of life, that we have this communion with the other side. And I will say that out of all the cultures that believe in an afterlife, that leave food offerings, Japanese have, some of the more traditional homes, as I understand it, altars to their loved ones, where they offer food and incense and nice things. This is a holdover from Egypt, where they did the same thing. And the reason why I mention this is the following. Out of all my personal research, I have never read a hieroglyph that said that they had communication with the afterlife. They simply believed that it existed. They believed that they had an embalming process that prepared you for it. And when they left out food, like I said, when the food gets rotted and dies, they think that's the spirit coming to eat the essence out of the fruit. But they never said, oh, and he said, how about that Cubs game? It never happened. And so throughout all history, we haven't had any indicators that anyone has ever made any contact with the other side in any overtly normal way. I mean, again, correct me, I'm sure you guys have better history than I do in those realms, but I haven't read anything about that. I've just heard the ceremonies that believe that there are souls, right? I suppose I could have gone down a whole haunted house thing where people of very specific genders haunt homes and stuff like that. It even carries some sort of physical impression of their previous being, like Walt Disney, for me. But that'll be for another episode because I don't know much about that stuff. So I hope you feel me. DeepThoughtsRadio.com for all the feeds. Again, there's video if you're on audio if you're on video. Your video options are YouTube and vid.me. Your audio is iTunes, Google Play, or just go to DeepThoughtsRadio.com on your mobile device and click the RSS feed link, and it will load up whatever podcast reader you have on your phone. We have a locked Facebook group. Sometimes I say page. I am mistaken when I say that. If you watch the old trailers to the old videos, I'm talking about the old website, mkultra.com, mkultraradio.com, and I talk about the old Facebook page, which we eventually shut down. Really appreciate your comments, both in YouTube and on Facebook. A lot of you are coming from the podcast over to the videos. The one benefit I'll say is that for some of the videos that are referencing a lot of inventions or science, sometimes I'll put up images, but I try to reference that in the episode so that you know that you're not getting the full package by just listening to it in audio. So just keep that in mind. Why don't you take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.